But I think that what people have failed to understand is that, or failed to potentially see, is that this is actually going to accelerate China's critical technology development rather than hold it down. It's all coming back to Chinese domestic companies. If you're an AI company, if you're an Chinese EV company, you're not going to be very comfortable still relying on NVIDIA chips, right? You're going to substitute for domestic chips. The Chinese people are like, whoa, this is not that bad, what happened. By the way, President Biden, do you mind also sanctioning our national men's football team too? We all think about China's models as being extremely centralized, right? That's our impression about China. It's only partially correct. It's political centralization coupled with an extreme form of economic decentralization.
Do you think the US sanctions and tariffs on China will actually work? According to Professor Keyu Jin, an economist and associate professor at the London School of Economics, they won't stand in China's way of rising. Curious? Check out her eye-opening speech now.
So I think that the source of US-China tension is about the Chinese development model, Chinese aspirations, but most critically, it's over Chinese technology. It's over technology, technological competition. That, I think, is the single biggest source of rivalry between the two, because as we know, in the next, going forward, who masters high-tech and critical technology is going to really not only shape all future global technologies, but whether it's economic, military consequences. And over time, I think, in the 1980s or something, only 10-15% of technologies were dual use. Now it's something like 70-80%. So this is really the core source of tension between the two countries. I think that we're going to see two parallel kind of developments of technological development. There's nothing that's going to stop China's technological development. It's just they're moving forward. But I think that what people have failed to understand is that, or failed to potentially see, is that this is actually going to accelerate China's critical technology development rather than hold it down. There are many, many historical instances, from the Napoleon blockade to the Germans in the two world wars. Every time you restrict technological exports, and this is also true with Japan, or their blockades, it actually mobilizes the entire nation and pushes them to actually achieve even a greater mobilize the entire country's resources to overcome these restrictions. And we're already seeing that with China. So Huawei, almost got killed, the handset business with the U.S. sanctions. Guess what? It's now come back to the best-selling handset in China, but seen, multiple folds of profits and growth, but also expanding in all different areas. Semiconductors, domestic Chinese semiconductors companies have seen something 6-fold increase in profits. Even the average increase in profits is something like 30% for many publicly listed companies. Why? Because all the demand for chips, and by the way, China imports as much chips as it does oil, is all coming back to Chinese domestic companies. If you're an AI company, if you're an Chinese EV company, you're not going to be very comfortable still relying on NVIDIA chips, right? You're going to substitute for domestic chips. The irony is that usually it's the domestic government, like a Chinese government, that will force you to adopt domestic components. Now, actually, U.S. is volunteering on China's behalf. And so we can see potential leapfrogging in China. Even in the short term, it might be painful. But we're also seeing a whole techno-nationalism at the macro level. Everybody's so geared up and mobilized to do technology. All the big techs, from Tencent to Alibaba, they're all tackling AI and chips even. They would have not had the motivation had it not been for these sanctions. By the way, there's a going joke. Chinese people are like, whoa, this is not that bad, what happened. By the way, President Biden, do you mind also sanctioning our national men's football team too?
The perception also colours the commentary now. And I think probably everyone in this room has read an article predicting the collapse of the Chinese economy, or certainly the recession that's going to come. Why is it, do you think, that so much commentary in the UK, in the US, is focusing on the downside with China and has got it so wrong year after year after year?
Since the 1980s, there have been 6 different versions of the China collapse story, none of which has transpired, and now it's currently peak China. Now, I'm sure we're going to come back to the current economic situation.
Yeah.
There's certainly, it's a challenging situation, but I wouldn't quite call it peak China. I think that's a misconceived notion. First of all, China has fostered a pretty unique model of how to grow, how to develop, that is unlike conventional standards. It grew it is, by the way, the country that has grown the fastest for the longest period of time, and it's quite remarkable given its size to be able to do that. But it's also defied a lot of conventional wisdom. But I think part of the reason I wanted to write my book is to suggest that there's not just one model that works. I mean, as a graduate student, as a Western trained economist, it's basically one model that makes things work. And I think that what China has offered, a very different form of, a combination of state mechanisms and markets, a huge role for state coordination and mobilization, which never features in any of our economic paradigms, have played a role. Not to say that there are not other challenges and fallacies, but I think the reason why we get it wrong is that we apply just one model, one standard. It has to fit these conditions, and without that, it's basically not going to work. And especially the role of the state. Yeah. We really, in our economics circle, there's very, very little role for the state. Very little, except for when there are market failures or regulations. But in China, jump-starting the whole system required massive state coordination, and even coming back to today, the EV market. China managed to develop the biggest consumer and producer market for EVs within 10 years. Guess what happened? It does help that the state rolls out 4 million EV charging stations around the country, as opposed to 160,000 in the US. We all think about China's models as being extremely centralized, right? That's our impression about China. It's only partially correct. It's political centralization coupled with an extreme form of economic decentralization. Right. So in fact, all the economic policies and implementation were up to the local officials to implement. So this massive decentralization, rolling out the reforms, and this partnership between governments enabling private entrepreneurs were really essential to kind of that making that success. So it wasn't the subsidies, it wasn't the kind of the picking winners, the industrial policies. It was that these mayors, I call this the mayor economy in my book. They were very incentivized to do a good job in their local jurisdiction because they wanted to be promoted. They want fiscal resources. They wanted to create GDP. So they helped the best and most productive private entrepreneurs. They helped them succeed. Yeah. And if you're not the UK or US that has a very ease of doing business and good rule of law, you really do need the government's help. Right. But this chicken and egg thing, jump-starting development or innovation, and that's China's current focus, the state played a big role.